Hi, welcome to the Splendid Sampler 2 Sew Along with me, Jenni Smith. This week's block is by a slightly more famous quilter, Jenny Doan of Missouri Quilt Company, and it's a Cathedral Window block. It's something I hadn't done before, even though it's a really familiar looking block in the quilting world, and I do really like the effect of it, but I was slightly scared of that precise top stitching that you need to get on this block. So follow along and I'll talk you through each step as we go. So apologies for my cup of tea stain on this pattern whilst I was studying it, but basically I've decided I like the impact of a cathedral window where the revealed part here in the centre really pops out. So I've decided to actually do my background in a lower volume fabric, so I'm using this Liberty Poem Blossom, and then for the cream squares here, which will curve back, then I'm using a similar tone fabric here. This is the Wiltshire shade from Liberty's Orchard Garden. And then what I want to do for my central window here is actually fussy cut something there. So you could cut yourself a 3.5 inch square of template plastic, or I've just cut a piece of paper to the right size because I can't find any template plastic at this moment. And actually all I'm going to do is, I know this is the correct size, so I want the orientation to be this way and to cover one of these butterflies here on the fabric. So I think this one is going to be best. So what I'm going to do is just lay the paper on top. I can kind of see through, but if not, I can just peel it back to ensure that will be centered. And it's quite close to the selvage at this edge here, but that's all going to be covered in the seam allowance. So I'll then just pop a couple of pins in and cut round, and then I'm ready to start constructing the block. So I've now taken my A squares here, and it's telling you to fold these over and to finger press them just in half diagonally. It doesn't actually mention in the instructions, but you need to ensure that the right side of the fabric is out on the outside there. So you're folding the wrong sides together like so, and you're finger pressing each of the units like so and pinning these into position, and you're pinning clear of these seams here because that's what you're going to sew together next. So now I'm going to sew these seams here, so I'm sewing this one to this and the same on the bottom with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. You are going through quite a lot, you're going through quite a lot of layers of fabric at this point. You've got 6 layers of cotton altogether, so I'm going to use my Aurifil 50 weight thread, which is nice and light. I'm also going to put my stitch length up a little bit to about 2.8 to 3. You'd normally have it a bit smaller for piecing, but I think when you're going through so many layers of fabric, you want it to still lay nice and flat. So if anything, I'd just do a little reverse stitch at the front, at the start and the end, but have a longer stitch length. When you press this open, then obviously again you've got quite a lot of layers, but you just have to open it out and press in there before you then stitch the next 2 rows together. And obviously there's quite a lot of bulk, but it won't come through onto the front of the block because it's covered up by this excess fabric here. It's important that when you sew these top and bottom sections together that you make sure that centre point there is aligned as well. So I've just pinned either side of it, and we'll stitch slowly up and over all those layers. So that's all now stitched and pressed. It's kind of weird to have so many layers of fabric going on in a quilt block, but I guess the trick with cathedral windows is that you don't overly quilt them in the section where you have the bulk of fabric anyway. You're stitching away from that edge out here. So next we've got to take our signature square and position that in place. To find the centre of your central square, the easiest thing to do is just to fold it across into a triangle, and then fold it again the other way, and just either do a little finger press or a press there, so that when you open that up, I can now see where the point is in the centre of my butterfly, and I'm going to align that now with the centre here on my block. block so that the seam allowance is then going to be equal all the way around. The instructions tell you now simply to fold this across and top stitch that down, but I would worry that this is going to shift a little bit, so I'm just going to go in with my tacking thread and actually pin and tack each of my curves so that I can really enjoy doing the machine top stitching here without worrying that the block's going to go off course, because actually it's been quite quick to get to this stage, so I think it's worth taking a little bit of time at the next step. So I've lined up these points exactly with the seam lines here, these corners of the square, and popped some pins in place, and then I've got a cotton basting thread, and I'm folding this back so that it's flush with the edge of my square there, so you get a nice curve, and I'm just basting it whilst it's flat on the table. I'm not basting right to the curve here because that's where my top stitching is going to go, so it's easier to pull out the basting stitches afterwards and not harm the fabric if you're just slightly off where you're actually going to be machining. But it doesn't take a minute really just to do each little section, and I think the results will be much neater at the edges here. You can see it just comes back to the seam allowance, and then I can turn it round and work through the other way. Okay, so I'm getting ready to machine top stitch on the cathedral windows. I've actually chosen to use my F-foot, which comes for applique and decorative stitches on my machine, because it's clearer here. It's not as covered as my regular foot. I can see what's going on, which I think is going to be helpful for the next stage. And I'd also recommend putting up your stitch length on your sewing machine. I think you don't want to, the default when I switch mine on is 2.2, which is fine for piecing, but I think actually because this is a decorative top stitch, then I would always go a little bit longer. So I'm going up to 3.0 for that. Okay, I'm not going to go super fast at this stage, and I'm just going to make sure actually that my needle's down when I start. So if I need to slightly lift the presser foot and ease around the circle as I go, then I can do a couple of stitches at a time, like so, to work my way around the cathedral window. Really trying to get quite close to the edge so that I'm definitely capturing the fabric underneath as well. So just keep moving around a little bit. Obviously you could also hand stitch this as well if you wanted to. Whichever, hand or machine, I'd still be tempted just to baste it first for the time that it takes, so that you enjoy the process more when you get to this. And as I'm coming up to this part here, I don't want to sew right up to the edge here. I'm just going to go machine to here and then pivot on the needle and then move down the other way. So I'll just carry on up to the top here, a couple more stitches to the join, and then pivot and work my way back round. So I've got a nice thread match as well with my Aurifil 50 weight, so it kind of sinks in to the fabric, but that's as I want it to be. So I've just machined round, which hopefully you can see now. And because I basted away from where I was going to machine, those stitches will come out easily. Then all that's left to do is to give it a press and just to trim off some of the fraying around the edges, and it's done. This is one of the blocks that has got the potential to shrink. I've just pressed it and I'm still 1/8 of an inch probably short, which is fine. Obviously when I sew it into the final quilt I can make allowances for that. But thinking about it, what you could do initially is you could cut the 4 background squares 1/4 of an inch or so bigger, and then when you are folding the triangles, as long as you fold those triangles down to this central point here, if you've got an excess of fabric here, that won't affect the overall construction of the block, and then you could just trim it down at the end. But otherwise I'm very pleased with my first cathedral window.